Holly Johnson. I am Dad's daughter, one of his daughters, and this is my sister, Heather Meyer. And we are thrilled that all of you are here today to celebrate Dad. And we have a few words that we want to share, and then we're going to be turning it off to my oldest son, Stephen, and he's going to be introducing some of his grandchildren, and they'll be telling some fun stories. Not yours, yeah, no. Dad's grandchildren. Yeah. A few butterflies. Thank you to everyone for coming today to celebrate, honor, remember, and share our favorite stories together about Dad. Dad was an amazing person who filled up a room with his booming voice, his infectious laugh, and today we share stories and memories to honor what a wonderful friend, colleague, professor, husband, dad, grandpa, and great-grandpa he was. It is so lovely to see this many people here gathered together to celebrate Dad. It brings great joy to our whole family and fills our hearts with love. We know today that although Paula is not here, that she is here in her heart and misses Dad deeply every day. She and Dad shared so much together, and of course they shared their love together, their love of books, literature, and the bookstore. We will be recording this celebration and making sure that she is able to watch it.
We would like to thank friends who helped greatly in planning and organizing this celebration for Chris. First, Chris's friend and colleague, Steve McKinnon, who suggested the University Club, which is such a perfect setting for today. He was so helpful in reaching out to us, offering his guidance, and contacting fellow colleagues about today's celebration. Thank you, Steve. We so appreciate you. Another colleague and friend we would like to thank is Philip Vandermeer for writing such a detailed and thoughtfully written academic obituary of Chris for the ASU Retirees Association. There are copies of this on the back table and other newspaper articles and awards about Chris. Thank you, Phil. We are also thankful for the families and friends who traveled from New Hampshire, Massachusetts, California, and Texas to be with us today. We are grateful for the many people that have helped us.
Yes. Thank you for everybody who has helped put this together. Now, Heather and I just want to share a little bit about our wonderful Dad. Dad had an infinite and ceaseless enthusiasm for life. One of his favorite sayings was, "In life, you show up." And boy, did he ever show up for all of us. He was an amazing father to Heather and I, always there for us, supporting, guiding, encouraging, laughing, and reassuring us as we went through life's ups and downs, with a never-ending optimism and a joy about life. One of Dad's greatest joys was being outdoors in nature. He loved its peace, solitude, and beauty, and he especially loved the beautiful Adirondacks in upstate New York, with their majestic high peaks and the rivers full of rainbow trout, just waiting for the perfect fly to drop from Dad's fly fishing rod. This love affair with the Adirondacks began when he was a small boy vacationing with his parents in Elk Lake, New York, and it continued with his teaching job at Northwood Prep School in Lake Placid, and finally with the summers spent at what came to be known very accurately as Smile House, a farmhouse built in 1836 in Jay, New York. We would spend many, many idyllic summer days hiking the high peaks, watching Dad fly fish, swimming in the Jay rocks with the backdrop of the covered bridge, then coming home to trout and wild blueberry pie dinners with family and friends, always with wonderful stories being told about the day's adventures.
Another great joy of Dad's was becoming a grandfather. He loved taking the grandchildren for adventures. This included going to the ballpark to watch the Diamondbacks, visiting museums, and having ice cream socials, or visiting the bookstore. How wondrous it was to have a grandpa who owned a bookstore. As time passed and the grandchildren began graduating from high school and college, and again Dad showed up, attending many graduations here in Arizona and New Hampshire, to make sure he was there to congratulate them all on their wonderful accomplishments. He was so very proud of each of them: Stephen, Megan, Michelle, Marissa, Nicholas, and Joelle. And we are so very happy that they are here today to celebrate their grandpa. We all deeply miss our dad and grandpa and his endless enthusiasm and energy. Now, Dad's oldest grandson, Stephen, who has become our family historian, will introduce each of Dad's grandchildren to share their special memory.
Thank you.
Sorry to spoil the presentation here. Here we go. Let's try this again. All right. Cool. Hello, everyone. I'm Stephen. Can you hear me? Yeah, I think that's good. I'm Stephen. I'm Grandpa Chris's eldest grandson, and while one of the things we always remember about Grandpa is how well, like his booming voice, how well he told stories. So I'm going to do my best to honor that and kind of segue us through some memories of us. But when we think about Grandpa Chris, he was an amazing grandpa. We adored him, and I know he adored us. So we thought it was going to be a fitting tribute to him to have each of his 6 grandkids share one of our favorite memories about some of the things that Grandpa loved and that kind of made him. Mom and Aunt Heather, you guys gave a great overview, and I want to come back to the Adirondacks and the outdoors for our first story. The Adirondacks really were like a second home to Grandpa, and the Smile House, which I think was bought at a blind auction for like a $2,000 bid in the 70s, which is kind of crazy to think about with home prices these days. But it was the site of so many memories for you all, and while it maybe hasn't gotten as much use in recent years, it is still home to a lot of memories, including a unforgettable night. So I'm going to hand over to Michelle to tell us our first story.
Thanks, Stephen. I wanted to share the story about the time Grandpa Chris took us all to the Smile House in Jay, upstate New York, that meant so much to him and our family. In Jay, we enjoyed visiting Candyman Chocolates, which we can all enjoy today, seeing the pretty waterfalls in the mountains and the streams, which Grandpa used to love to fish and hike in. We also had fun seeing the locals who remembered the Smith family fondly after all their summers in Jay, thanks to Grandpa's infectious personality. So this one night, as we settled in, the 4 oldest grandchildren and our black lab Thule decided we would stay at the Jay house with Grandpa, which hadn't been lived in for some time now. We all thought the outhouse, the bats, the creaky floors were charming, but also a little scary. That night, in the middle of the night, Grandpa Chris came downstairs to use the bathroom, and he yelled, "There's a black bear!" All the kids woke up and scrambled, and we realized it was just Thule the black lab. Needless to say, I spent the night scared, curled up in my sleeping bag and not sleeping. This memory will remind me of all the adventures and funny stories we have shared with Grandpa Chris, a quirky, loving individual who had the ability to animate any experience, ever introducing more excitement into our lives through his imagination.
Thank you, Michelle. The Smile House is definitely a legendary place. I know I went on a trip there with Grandpa and Paula once when I was really young, and I grew up. My dad, who's here, visited once, and he swears to this day he saw a ghost. So I grew up with ghost stories at the Smile House, and on that trip, I remember the first night I went up, I kicked Paula out of the bed, and I was like, "No, I'm sleeping with you, Grandpa. I'm not too terrifying. I can't do it." I was like 10, so it wasn't like I was 20 or something. No, but I think the Adirondacks started blossoming this love of the outdoors and really a sense of adventure in Grandpa. I know for those summers that you guys used to drive across country, and Grandpa refused to go on the main highways. He always took the back roads, stopped at every single historical marker. And I think that sense of adventure, that, sense of really being curious about the world has, transferred down to all of us, and that is where I want to introduce our next story, which was an adventure that Grandpa took a lot of us on, which was a visit to the nation's capital. So I'm going to have Megan come up and tell that story.
All right. So we went to D.C. on the 4th of July. What more iconic place to be with an American history professor at our nation's capital? I remember hearing about the sites, and way more than what was written on the museum placards, and I was always in awe of how much he could recall. I think Grandpa was even teaching the tour guides things that you wouldn't be able to find in the history books. The 4th of July also leads me to another memory. Grandpa was there on the day that I met my now husband, Carlton, 15 years ago. There were fireworks, and he was there making a memorable first impression with his big beard, suspenders, and eclectic pins. And I wish I could remember all of the stories, but I'll never forget laughing around the dinner table, reminiscing about past times. And I know he touched so many lives throughout his time with us. And we share all of our memories, lots of stories, and we continue to with the next generation, his great-grandchildren who are here today, who I'm sure you've heard from already, and you'll see more of. But we know that Grandpa's spirit will live on in all of us.
Yeah, and that was just one example of one of the historical adventures he took us on. Another big adventure that he literally took the entire family, it was basically a family reunion, was in 2012 we did and I'll change the slide now so I don't interrupt again. He took us on an Alaskan cruise, which was spectacular. And so I want to invite Marissa up to share a few memories of the Alaskan cruise.
Yeah, I will always cherish the time Grandpa took all of us grandkids on an Alaskan cruise. The destination of Alaska, a truly breathtaking place where we could view glaciers and wildlife from the sea, encompasses Grandpa's appreciation of nature and being outside. But looking back on that trip, although the natural beauty we saw was unforgettable, I can't help but remember how much our stomachs all hurt from laughter all week. On the cruise ship, Chris and all the kids ran through the hallways, laughed at our reflection in the fancy elevators, and ate too much seaweed salad. Also, Grandpa encouraged all 17 of us to rent and ride bikes in a small Alaskan town that barely had more than 17 people. And we all enjoyed the weird stares we got. Grandpa always found joy and humor in the small pleasures of life. I will always remember Grandpa for not only appreciating beauty, but lighting up any room by creating laughter and love in everyday life.
So moving along, and I'm going to introduce Nicholas in a second to tell our next story, but one of the things we got to do on the trip was another one of Grandpa's favorite things, which was fishing. He was an avid fisherman. Every small town has that one person that knows all the secret spots, and Grandpa was that guy in the Adirondacks and Jay. And so I'm going to let Nicholas now talk about the last time we got to fish with him on the Alaskan cruise.
Slide.
Thank you.
There we go. Yeah, we don't want to miss the fish photos, right?
I know.
Thank you. All right. What a catch Grandpa Chris was, right, everybody? So I feel honored to not only share my middle name with Grandpa Chris, but to also share so many of his interests, from baseball, history, books, and of course one of his absolute true loves, fishing. As you've heard, Grandpa Chris was an avid fly fisherman throughout his early years. He really made his mark on the Adirondacks fishing waters. Everybody in Jay, New York knew he was the one to ask for a hot tip on a great nearby fishing spot. There are a few old photos we found from these earlier years of Grandpa with his fishing hat and pipe where he looks exactly like the classic Americana character. That image that kind of embodied the kind of history he loved and what classic American Southwest paintings used for inspiration. On our wonderful Alaskan cruise, my brother and my dad were blessed to be able to go to Alaskan salmon fishing in Ketchikan, Alaska, with Grandpa on a boat. And that was the one and only time I ever fished with him, besides fishing for customers at the bookstore with gummy night crawlers. My brother got to fish with him in Jay, New York once, and I'll always envy you for that. With Grandpa on the boat, we felt extra lucky, and boy were we. We ended up with an excellent haul that day of 13, you can count them, nice sized salmon, and they were silver salmon, I believe. And we had the fish frozen and shipped home so we could enjoy them later. Grandpa definitely got some great time on the reel that day and helped reel in those Alaskan greats. He yelled out "Wowee" every time anyone landed a fish. His excitement was far greater than anyone who was reeling in the fish. We have a couple pieces of his old fishing gear that we like to take with us to tap into that good luck once more, and it's already paid off on one trip. I know Grandpa's doing what he truly loves every day in heaven, going fishing.
And if fishing's a sport, so is baseball. Yep. Grandpa loved America's pastime, and in an interest of time, I won't go over the dozens and dozens of games that he took us there, but I did want to call out a couple of just memories. In basically when the Diamondbacks came to Phoenix in 1998, it became a regular thing for Grandpa to take some mixture of the grandkids to catch a ball game. And I think one of the things I remember most about going to the Diamondbacks and going to baseball with Grandpa was he would never let us leave until the very end. He always stayed until the bitter end. And there was one time that it really paid off. The Diamondbacks were getting destroyed. And so to save their pitchers, they brought in Mark Grace, who was our old first baseman. And it was like a comedy show. He made the entire stadium crack up. He was imitating some of the other pitchers who had really funny wind-ups and stuff. And Grandpa actually got on TV on that game. I have a little clip of him laughing and stuff. So, we never would have seen that if he hadn't made us stay to the bitter end every single time. And then the last story I want to introduce, and I want to move into probably another, I keep saying one of the things that we remember Grandpa most about. He had so many interests and things that he loved, but he definitely was a collector. We won't say hoarder, he was a collector. But he loved collecting political buttons, ties, and then most of all books. And the love of collecting books ended up having him lead to opening the Old Town Books, which we all know and love, and I'm sure have shopped in there. And so I want to introduce his last grandkid, Joelle, to talk about her time at Old Town Books.
Thank you, Stephen. I will do the slide. Don't even worry about it. So, as Stephen said, I was the final grandchild and final last generation to have the privilege of working at the bookstore. I also have the privilege to say that I was Grandpa Chris's only grandchild to attend ASU and continue on his legacy here. Thank you. It is good to be back. It's been a few years. But I used to always study in the social sciences building right across the way because it was the prettiest building on campus. If anyone's been there, it has this beautiful fountain in the middle of it, and it's just a great place to study. And that was all before Grandpa had told me that was where his office was. So I always knew that there was a special connection to there. So during my college years, I used to walk over from campus on Fridays and Saturdays and open the bookstores with my mom and Grandpa and Paula. And I will always remember Grandpa greeting every customer that walked through the door with we're a general use bookstore, pretty well categorized. Let us know if you need help finding anything. And boy, they knew where to find anything. Old friends, new customers, previous students, and even Elvis sometimes would walk in with requests that Grandpa and Paula could most likely be able to fill. The bookstore to me was a place to study, a volunteer gig, a family meeting place to share some Prosecco and cider, a parking spot for easy access to Mill, for those that know, And most importantly, a place to spend quality time with Grandpa and his many stories. With COVID and Grandpa's passing, I was very sad that the bookstore was coming to an end and that I would be the last generation to have an opportunity to work in this magical place as everyone who walked through the doors at Old Town Books had experienced. Thank you.
All right, so I think then again, he had many interests and hobbies, but I think as a good segue is the last thing that I think Grandpa was definitely known for is his love of history and being a fabulous teacher. And so from this point, I actually want to hand over to Steve to take us through the rest of it and share some of great stories and have other people share memories of Grandpa as a teacher.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you.
I remember this.
Hi, everybody. It's working, isn't it? Yes. Hi, everybody. I'm Steve McKinnon, and Chris and I arrived with our families and young kids at ASU from God knows where in 1971. And we had offices next to each other, and building over here was sort of a biology, botany building. We were kind of by ourselves with bugs and snakes and things. And we've been friends ever since. So the rest is history. I'm not going to tell stories right now. I'd love to, but we promised ourselves that we would be brief. And by 4 o'clock, we would all eat and celebrate. And the idea is that we're switching into a community event at this point of Chris's life in Arizona. You might say an old-fashioned wake is what I at least envision that we move into. And there are many dimensions to Chris's life, and a lot of them are represented here today. I mean, there's Gail and Bobby from the Changing Hands Bookstore, Dan Schaefer from the Arizona Humanities Council, Carol is here, and there are handballers. I don't know if there's any extra Santa Clauses here, but there may be. Students like Marcy Hutchinson, who is now a politician, I believe, and so on. I could go on and on. But anyway, we have what a group, and we need to talk to each other and about Chris and so forth. So I'm going to take the role as sort of the timekeeper and try to cut off this end of speaking by 4 o'clock so we can all kind of mix and mingle. And I know the food is going to be served right at that time. So we're going to begin with Phil Vandermeer, who was already introduced slightly, and then move to, I'm sorry, just hold on. Then we're going to move to Ron Duncan. Maybe you heard the webcast on KJazz from Ron, who was an MA student. We're going to hear from Ron for a minute. And Mary Rothschild, a colleague and a longtime family friend. And then we're going to have a brief message that's come in today from Paula. And then a poem at the end from Rod, his boyhood high school friend who lived in Phoenix and so forth. And then stop at 4 o'clock. That's sort of the idea. If there's time for other people to chime in before 4 o'clock, we'll get to that. But I suspect that might not really happen. Okay, so.
I'm going to talk really fast. I actually heard of Chris in 1971. I was starting graduate school at the University of Illinois, and my advisor, Lynn Bates, said, "There's this student of mine, Chris Smith," and a smile spread across his face. And when I came to ASU in 1985 and met Chris, I understood exactly why. Chris was ebullient, joyous, and what a fantastic storyteller. There are many things that one could talk about with Chris in terms of teaching. Obviously, that personality endeared him to students, but that was really just a very small part of it. Chris cared deeply about his students, and they understood that, but he was also smart. about teaching. And he acted sort of casually about teaching, but the truth is that he was very intent on this. I remember early on discovering that he assigned 13 books in one of his classes. I told him he was remarkably brave, and why had he done that? He said, "I don't know that they're going to read all the books in the class, probably not, but I just hope they'll read them later on." He was, of course, hoping they would be able to buy them back from the bookstore, but and having seen Chris at book sales where I'd have to fight him to buy books at the Tempe Library sale, I understood what he had in mind. But one of the more striking things to me was that Chris blended the notion of trying to get classes through with some understanding that students had different habits and lives and so forth. So I asked him one time about papers. I was expressing a frustration. The students didn't get their papers in on time. And Chris's strategy was, first he said he had a deadline, that they were supposed to hand them in, and if they did, then he would grade them and get them back by the last day of the class. The second option was they could get it to him the last day of class, and he would get it graded, maybe not marked, by the exam. There was a third option. You could turn in the paper the day of the exam, and he would someday grade it. That's it. Thanks.
I don't know what I can add here. I'm not sure there's really much that I can say that hasn't already been said. We have all these memories, all these stories. Everyone remembers The Office. We remember the voice and the laugh and the rolled up sleeves and his optimism. We remember the neckties. God, they were awful. It's part of my job to talk to people. In the last few months, I've had the great pleasure of talking to a lot of people about Chris. I've come away with the sense that he was this force in people's lives, as he was in mine. I know that he had to deal with a lot of disappointment, like we all do, grumpy coworkers, flaky students, in-laws, divorce, and a world that just kept moving faster for no apparent reason. But I don't ever recall him ever saying a cross word. I only remember the patience and the kindness. When I started my master's, I had no idea what I was doing, but Chris walked me through it. I've heard horror stories about people who didn't have someone like him. And, he steered me away from a few projects. He could say no, firmly but nicely. And I remember even having to do some rewrites on my thesis. And I had two things going for me. One was I was a copy editor, so I rewrote stuff for a living. So it took me a while to get my mind around this massive rewrite. And the other thing I had was Chris. And he said, we'll get through this, and we did. So I came away with this degree, but now I know I came away with a lot more. I have all these memories, and one of my regrets is that we never went fishing together. We always talked about it, but it never happened. I also figured out that I have a lot in common with a lot of these people here who have the same stories, and this person that we thought the world of. We should get together more often. I think also his love of books wore off in me. I don't know what else to say other than I admired the way he sort of kept the digital age at arm's length. One of my favorite stories was Michael Crow wanting to find out who this L. Chris Smith was that worked for ASU. He had no idea who this person was. He only knew that this person had an email account. He had never once sent or received an email. Never even opened the account. And one of Michael Crow's emails came over at 1:30 in the morning. And so you kind of wonder who had the right idea there, right? Chris believed in personal communication, which is something I think is missing in this world, which keeps getting faster for no apparent reason. When I think of Michael Crow up past midnight, sending that email about Chris, I have to smile. Chris touched every one of this in this room, and I miss him.
Well, I have 7.5 minutes that I've been told I have to cut to nothing. But these two pictures are my two sons, now 52 and 46, with Chris at Santa. And they were really surprised that Chris knew their names when they hadn't introduced themselves. And I told them it was because Chris was magical. And Santa was magical, and he was. Because they knew Chris very well and loved the girls who were their babysitters. We go back a long time, and I, too, was happy to be at Smile House in Jay for one lovely weekend with my family and Chris and the girls. I actually wrote to a bunch of students, former students of Chris's, and all of them wrote back incredibly moving things, which I'll give to you all since I can't read them all. But I will say that Adam Tompkins, for instance, had Chris in his final pro sem, went off to Penn State, got cancer, and had to come back to Arizona for chemo. He only had, he says, about 4 good days every 2 weeks. And Chris said, because Adam was so sad and lonely and miserable, come by my office, come to class. And Adam says it made all the chemo treatment different. He did, in the end, get a degree, master's at Penn State and a PhD here, and he teaches in Japan now. Chris Marine wrote a long essay about what Chris meant to her in terms of passing this required class, which was a keep out of graduate school class. She was a first generation college student. I think most of you, or many of you in this room, know Chris, who was head of the Chicano Studies collection. And the guy who taught it and was such a SOB left, and Chris took it over, and she said he changed her whole life and made it possible for her to get her PhD. Sidell Golston, several of you know Sid, Dick certainly does, who is a history teacher and administrator at Phoenix Union, and also the past president of NCSS, and the current curriculum developer for PBS's American History programs, said, and I'm going to read her specifically, I took American cultural history from Chris in the 1970s, some of the memories, the whole class singing temperance songs, readings from the Book of Mormon. If you could make a barrel that would hold water when he poured a pitcher of water into it, you didn't have to take the midterm. Every class was a scholar's party, a marvelous teacher and a dear man. Judy Jacobson remembered that she had somebody dropped off her master's committee, and she was desperately trying to find someone to finish so she could finish her master's. She never had a class from Chris, but he volunteered, helped her with her master's thesis, and she was able to finish. Over the years, I would stop at the bookstore to see him, and he would always greet me like an old friend, such a kind, wonderful human being. The world needs more people like him. Phyllis Gendreau, a history teacher in Glendale, wrote that she never was privileged to have a class with him, but graded AP papers with him in New Jersey. My friend John Wonder, who's at the University of Nebraska, wrote me just yesterday, for years I graded AP exams with Chris. I so looked forward to being with him for a week in the hot summer of New Jersey. He often came with his parents driving him to the campus, and we always had extensive and delightful talks. I can understand implicitly why you miss him. So do I. What a wonderful soul. And Ann Johnson, who was a reporter I'm skipping a lot of people, believe it or not, for the Arizona Republic, wrote, "Chris was my MA advisor. He once told me most folks don't read more than 10 books a year. And thereupon, I set my mission to read way more than that. And I have. Books have become my refuge, my guide, my solace. He introduced me to Wallace Stegner, Aldo Leopold, Edward Albee, Student Udall, and I am forever grateful. What a teacher, what an inspiration. His legacy includes his many students who will pass on his love of books to future generations. And I'm going to end with one story of mine. I was feeling overworked and overwhelmed one day because I was teaching about 450 students that semester, was on 2 university committees, 2 college committees, and 1 department committee. The result of the university's new commitment to having at least 1 woman or person of color on every committee, which was in one way a big step forward, and in another way a disaster in my personal, untenured professional life. And my children were little then too. One morning, Chris came by my office to ask me about a graduate thesis committee we were both on. We had tons of graduate students in common. And saw me writing a to-do list which already had more than 20 items on it. "Big day," he said. "Yeah, and I'm ready to give up already," I sighed. "Haven't you done something already today?" he asked. "I mean, don't you always make your kids' lunches and your own?" I was known for eating in my office. "Yes," I said, not really understanding where this conversation was going. "Write them down at the top of the paper." Then he said, "Any other things?" "Well, I've made 2 committee phone calls already." "Write them down too," he said. "Now, cross them all out, one by one. Doesn't that make you feel better?" And laughing hysterically, I said, "It really does." He said, "I never write a to-do list without putting at least 1 or 2 things on the front of it that I can cross off. And you know, inveterate list maker that I am, I have done that ever since for the last 44 years. Another one of Chris's kindnesses that has made my life better. I miss him and feel so fortunate I got to know him and Holly and Heather and Carol and call them all my friends. Here's to Chris and his kindnesses to all of us.
All right, we're moving along. We need to have, there's a message here from Paula, a short message from Paula.
Thank you, Steve. Paula would like to thank everyone for being here today and for appreciating Chris, whose deepest essence radiated kindness. Chris's very presence in a room could bring people joy. His easy, sweet smile, his tenderness, his words, which so often seemed to be just the right ones at just the right time. He was equally as comfortable sitting at a bar with you, clinking beer mugs, or sharing a glass of milk and cookies at your kitchen table. And of course, he'd never pass up a picnic anywhere or a chance to share an ice cream social, where he might quote with gusto, "The only emperor is the emperor of ice cream." He might even surprise you talking about The Cabin, a poem by Lauren Isley that always fascinated him, or regale you with wild hiking and fishing stories, especially those set in the cherished Adirondack Mountains. Peter Iverson, ASU Regents professor, who sadly was lost in 2021, wrote of Chris, "He is above all a teacher, perhaps the best teacher I've ever known." He wrote also that on many occasions I have looked back on a thesis or dissertation and realized that once again Chris had asked the most searching and most significant questions. In Chris's own words, When queried, "Are there lessons to be learned from the past?" he answered, "I certainly would not spend a large portion of my life thinking about the past without believing there are important things the past teaches us. One thing it should teach us is humility in a very complex world, and it should teach us tolerance." When asked, "Is there still room for a Mr. Chips kind of teacher?" Chris replied, "I would fervently hope so. We whose hearts are broken from losing Chris fervently hope so too, even though we all know Chris is irreplaceable."
I think we're going to close now and get to the party part with Rod Dashnell. Has a short poem.
Certainly there's no reason to say anything more about the things that have been covered here that are in this poem. And I'm pleased that the family asked me to read the poem. It means so much to me and my family, who come from the Adirondacks. As a matter of fact, the Smile House, I don't know if you all knew this, even in the family, that house was owned by my grandmother's brother, whose name was Melville Thwaites. And they tell the story of the day that Mel passed away. The post office always drives by, and it was down. Smile House is down. They didn't tell you this. You got to drive down in pretty low territory, and your cars can get stuck. So the guy stayed up at the top, and his wife saw the mailman coming, opened the door, called up, "Tell him in town that Nellie's gone." That was the way things were, and that's what Chris was all about, American history. And so I will read this and then just end up with a little song. And actually, it's sort of like a metaphor. I didn't realize this until I was hearing all of these stories from so many of you different people. But everything ends the same way. Oh, excuse me. Everything ends the same way in all the things that you have said. Anyway, the Adirondack homesickness could be like a metaphor for what's happening here today with the family, the Smith family. Excuse me, I'm sorry if can you hear back there? Okay. Anyway, I think to me this is sort of like a metaphor. Adirondack homesickness is, when you hear some of these things, you'll see that it really does say, when it says come home, it means home to the Adirondacks. My heart for verdant mountains longs, where trills the whitethroat with its songs, and mossy rocks and sparkling brook can ne'er be pictured in a book. Shadows shift the mountain scene, making every pause serene. To climb once more those lofty peaks is where my soul forever seeks. Come back where the hills are green. Come home to the mountain scene, where flows the Ausable through the valley keen, a scenic sight forever serene. By Christian Lewis Smith Jr., Chris's dad, poet laureate of Jay, New York. I have one other thing I'd like to add. Shakespeare writes in The Death of Brutus, in Julius Caesar, The Death of Brutus, and I'll take freedom to change this a little bit. This was the noblest Roman of them all. His life was gentle, and the elements so mixed in him that nature might stand up and say to all the world, this was a man. Thank you.
You can finish. Do you want me to wrap it up? Okay. No, thank you so much, everyone, for all those great stories. There's we're obviously overflowing today. We got a more than a sellout crowd. So we invite you now to, there should be food on the back kind of left. So help yourself, have a drink, share as many stories as you can of Grandpa and how much he impacted all of us. And yeah, I just enjoy each other's company, remembering a great man. Thank you.